This is LRS Architecture's Fall 2022 Continuing Education Series webinar. And today we are talking about electric vehicle charging stations and the new CBC code updates. I'm going to just keep adding people in here as they come. We have a lot of new people to us registered for today's webinar, so we wanted to give you a little bit of an introduction to who we are before we get started today. Teaching our class today is Lewis Springer. He's an architect and CASP and the founder and owner of LRS Architecture. I'm Erica McCaffrey. I will be running the Zoom presentation today, as well as monitoring the chat. We do ask that if you have any questions that you post them in the chat, and then we're going to answer all questions at the end of the presentation. And then just a quick housekeeping item. If you are logged into Zoom, I see a couple names are like conference rooms or company names. If you could go ahead and put your name in the chat and ask if you want a CE certificate emailed to you. I have everyone's email from the registration list, but I can only send that to people who join us live today. So if your name isn't appearing as your personal name, if you could just drop that in the chat so I know to send you the certificate as well. All right, next slide, please. So just a brief introduction of LRS Architecture before we dive in. We were founded in 2000 by Lewis Springer. And originally we were a residential design build firm. And I say we because I was very present. I was in 7th grade and it started in our house. If you're new to us, Lewis is also my dad. But in 2012, while trying to keep his small business afloat, Lewis got invited to join the team that did the inspections for Placer County, for all buildings owned by Placer County. And so in 2014, he got certified as a CASP, and we started offering certified access specialist services. And the reason that we kind of wanted to go that route was twofold. First of all, we saw a lot of small businesses in our local community being sued for ADA related issues. And some of them had to close their doors because they couldn't face the burden of those lawsuits. One of our favorite breakfast spots, we drove by one day and the building had literally just been leveled. And we found out later it was because they'd gotten sued, and the only way to get out of the tens of thousands of dollars of legal fees was to just no longer exist. And so it literally was wiped from the face of the earth, which made us very sad. And at the same time, Lewis also had his next door neighbor and a good friend had a neoblastoma, and she was in surgery and had a stroke. And it left her paralyzed on one side. And so at points in her recovery, she was in a wheelchair, and at points she was had very limited mobility. And he, being a good friend, took her to lots of appointments, took her to physical therapy, and really saw firsthand how those issues that businesses were being sued for really impacted someone with a disability, in this case, a mobility issue. And so we wanted to be a bridge between those two sides of the coin. We wanted to provide resources for businesses and anyone working in the corporate real estate world so that they could be accessible, make accessibility easier for everyone involved, so that the people that need those services have them and can access goods and services. And the way we do that is by offering CASP inspections and reports. They've come a long way since 2014, ours have at least, and we offer a variety of inspections and reports today versus when we started. So some of the reports that we offer are limited to just path of travel, and you'll hear later about how we, sorry, I'm trying to let people in and talk at the same time. How we worked with architects in the past to provide path of travel upgrades when they're doing a TI or a remodel, so that they know just what they need to do to incorporate their ADA requirements. We also do consulting, plan review, access design, and Lewis has been an expert witness on lawsuits. We have another one going in the Bay Area right now as well that he's the expert witness on. All right, so today's learning objectives, we are talking all about electric vehicle charging stations. First, we're going to get into the ADA versus the CVC, and then we're going to talk about the new CVC code requirements. That's going to include the scoping requirements and the technical requirements. And then Lewis created some diagrams to help talk about design solutions so that you can reach compliance and achieve accessibility at the same time, because there are some conflicts in there. And then we have a slide with some additional resources for you as well. And now I'm going to turn it over to Lewis. You are muted.
Okay. Whoops. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I skipped a slide. Sorry about that. Okay. So today I want to really kind of talk about designing EVCS spaces, what the code requirements are, and then what the ADA guidelines are. So the code requirements actually took effect July 1st of 2021. It's the first appearance in the code for electric vehicle charging stations. And so there's code requirements, and then the ADA at the same time that the California was developing their code requirements, the Federal Access Board was putting together the ADA guidelines. They're considered guidelines today because they haven't gone through the rulemaking process to actually become incorporated into the standards. So at this point, they're just really kind of recommendations as opposed to what to do, as opposed to the requirements of what you have to do. So keep that in mind as we go through and kind of discuss the different requirements out there today. My mouse keeps doing weird stuff. So, whenever you're dealing with accessibility, the first key is to talk about scoping. And today's discussion is really the scoping for the accessible units. It's not really going to talk about scoping as far as what is required by the various jurisdictions of what they're going to require for the total number of EVCS. There's also requirements in the green code for electric vehicles, which you'll need to pay attention to, but today's focus is really on the accessible requirements for EVCS. So in there, if there's any existing facilities, they actually are exempted from requiring to comply with the technical requirements. It's only if you're installing new EVCS accessible spaces that have to comply with what was adopted last year. So the second, that's the 1.1, and then 1.2 is operable parts. Where the code actually requires that all of the chargers comply with 11B 309.4, which is the requirement that they cannot have grasping, pinching, or twisting requirements, and they can't exceed 5 pounds of force in order to operate. 11B 228.3.2 talks about the minimum number of parkings of EVCS charging stations. And so that's what the table is that we're looking at on the left. So the charging, the number of spaces is actually based on the different charging levels and the different EV connector types. There's multiple ones out there. So if you have multiple ones on the site, this actually, you would have to provide a van accessible space, say if you have for each different type of charger, it doesn't really address the fact of putting multiple chargers at the same location. It really talks about creating the minimum number of spaces per those chargers. And then the other component of that is talking about the different facilities. Facility, I find a little confusing in the code, because in parking facilities, it kind of talks about if we have separate parking lots, there's separate facilities. The code under the electric vehicle portion, it actually talks about the different charging types and as being different facilities. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later as well. And then, so the minimum number that has to be required is for public use and common use. So if you have fleet vehicles, this doesn't really apply to a fleet vehicle, or if you have designated spots for electric vehicle charging stations for like designated employees or something, this code doesn't actually apply to that. So just like in determining the number of parking spaces, the same is true with this table here. The difference is one of the things is that when you're determining the accessible spots in an existing, so if you have existing, let's say you have 10 existing ones and you're going to install 16 new ones, this table is for 26 total, not just the 16 new ones that you would be providing. The code actually talks about there's really kind of 3 different accessible spaces. As you can see here, that as soon as you get to 26 spaces, there's a requirement for a van accessible space, there's requirements for standard accessible space, and there's requirements for ambulatory accessible spaces. So let's dive into some of the technical components. So the technical components are described in 11B812. There's 6 basic elements that get designed into an EVCS charging space. And those 6 need to be interrelated too with curb ramps and blended transitions and detectable warning, and 11B250, which talks about raised circulation paths. And so you need to take all 6 of these and interrelate it with the other code elements that are going to be affected with path of travel, I should say, with circulation paths. So the components are, you have to have a connection to an accessible route. There's requirements for the vehicle space itself. There's the requirements for the access aisle. There's requirements for signage. It's then surface markings, and also the charger requirements. So let's take a look at some of these more in depth. So an EV space has to be, the accessible EV space has to have an accessible route to the building entrance. Now, unlike parking spaces, there's no requirement that these have to be on the closest accessible route. It just, you have to provide that accessible route. You have to have an accessible route to the charger itself. For 812.5.3, the relationship to the accessible route is that your vehicle cannot block the accessible route. So, if you see like when a walkway is in front of a parking space, a lot of times a vehicle can go and encroach over that accessible route, and all of a sudden the accessible route gets too narrow and it blocks it. So you have to make sure that the vehicle can't block the accessible route. You can't travel behind another vehicle. That's the 0.4. And then you can't have any obstructions that are going to block that accessible route. I've seen some where they put a charger on one side and they just drag it right across the access aisle and plug it into a vehicle. And all of a sudden that access aisle is blocked from getting to the accessible route because the cable is blocking it. So that is not allowed under the code. So there's 4 different accessible spots that you could have on a site. As you saw from the chart, the first one that always gets constructed would be a van. And under the CBC, the minimum length of any of the van standard and ambulatory spaces is 216 inches. There's an exception to that rule. So if the long side's parallel to the direction of traffic, then that length has to be expanded to 240 inches. And then the 3 different spaces have different widths. So a van accessible spot has to be 144 inches. The standard accessible spot has to be 108. And the ambulatory spot is 120. Now it's different than the parking regulations. So parking, basically for a van is the same spacing, 144 and 60. Although in parking, you're allowed to have an 8-foot access aisle and a 9-foot van space. An EV charging space does not have that exception. The van space has to be 144 inches with a 5-foot access aisle. And the reason is so that you're not blocking where somebody actually needs to park and get out of their car and get to the access aisle. So they have more leeway of where they place their car in that spot and not be in something that would be designated as a no parking area. And then there's the drive up space, which imagine like a typical gas station, and you're going to drive up and fuel your vehicle. I have not seen one of these yet. I hear that somebody, that might be in the works. I've yet to see one, but it's kind of like I said, a typical gas station one where you can drive up and charge your car. That space has to be 204 inches by 240 inches. And there's no striping that's required. So you don't have to have the access aisle. It's just, you just have to have the designated spot for that. So like I said, the 82.7 talks about location marking and lettering. So the access aisle has to be on an accessible route. So whether the accessible route is in front of the vehicles or at the end of the access aisle, either going away from the parking or going across the drive aisle, one of those accessible routes has to join the access aisle. The space has to be 60 inches wide, and then it has to have hatch lines at 36 inches on center. The marking for it has to be a contrasting color, but it cannot be blue. Okay. Blue's reserved for handicap parking spaces and should never be used to designate only electric vehicle charging stations. Now, if this is a shared access aisle and one of these spaces is a handicap parking space and the other one is an EVC charging station, then it would be outlined in blue, because now it's being used by the handicap parking space itself. So just keep that in mind. Never blue unless it's shared. And then the lettering, that's the 12-inch no parking sign that has to be visible from the drive aisle, just like in a parking space. So signage gets to be a little bit more confusing than what's required at parking. So if there's 4 or fewer total electric vehicle charging stations, then there's actually no signs required. So you are required to have a van accessible space, but that van accessible space does not need to have a sign with an ISA. If you have 5 to 25 spaces, then the van accessible spot needs to have a sign with an ISA. Okay, there's no requirements that it say van accessible. There's no requirements for 250 minimum fine, because that's actually a vehicle code for the parking spaces. Technically, these are electric vehicle charging stations. They are not parking spaces, so they're not regulated by that. So the only requirement is that there is an ISA, and nothing else. It's actually perfectly legal for anybody to use the accessible EVC charging spaces. So as you can see, this image is actually taken from the access board, and the bottom line says use last. That's because anybody can actually use this space, but if you're not requiring an accessible space, then use the other spaces first and then come into this space. So then if there's greater than 26 total parking spaces, then all of the van and all of this standard accessible spaces that would be required, all are required to have an ISA. So for ambulatory and drive up spaces, there's no signs required. And just like in for a parking space, the signs have to be reflectorized and the signs have to be 70 square inches. The location of those, this is from the access board, it shows 60 inches minimum. The 60 inches minimum is only if it's in a landscaped area or non-circulation path area. As soon as you get into a circulation path, that needs to be 8 inches high. I always use the circulation path as opposed to an accessible route, because you could have an accessible route that's not part of the circulation path. But if it's in a circulation path, you really want to be able to go under it and not hit it all the time with your head. So 80 inches in any circulation path. So 812.9, the language for surface markings is really only the EVC charging. That's what's the language of the code. The figure that's in the code that talks about 812.9 surface marking actually kind of dimensions all of them. But it's really the language is the EVC charging, which is, it needs to be at the end of the parking, at the end of the space, and then within 6 inches of center line. So that's the requirements of 812.9. So I wish they kind of limited to the image to that, or redefined what the image was. I think a lot of people see this and they see it, okay, this is how I'm going to design a parking space. I'm sorry, a EVC charging station. And I'm going to get into of how that kind of looks in just a minute. And then 812.10 talks about the charges themselves. So, there's kind of 4 points. The charger itself has to have all the correct operable parts. So the operable parts, it can't be like in the lower right-hand image. The maximum height is going to be 48 inches to any operable part. The minimum height off the ground is 15 inches. So everything has to be within that range between the 15 and 48 inches as far as where the operable parts are located. The point of sale device, like in the upper right-hand corner, that's all governed by 11B707. I'm not going to go into that in this presentation. If you are reviewing the specs for the charger that's going to be installed, make sure that that any of the point of sale devices comply with that 11B707. To have access to the charger, you need to comply with 11B 12.3, which is to provide an accessible clear floor space in front of that charger. Now this is from the access board. You can see on the left-hand side. So The requirement is to either have a forward or a parallel approach. The access board actually recommends having a parallel approach. And so if you have bollards that are creating an issue, they actually recommend to have a 60-inch minimum for a parallel approach, even though the requirements in the code is actually only to have a 48-inch, 30 by 48-inch space. So you might want to keep that in mind when you're designing where that clear floor space is if it's obstructed for that to have a parallel approach to it. So then the next is the location of where the charger needs to be. Per the code, which is 1112.10.4, the charger is supposed to be within the projected width of the parking space, which you can kind of see in this upper right-hand corner. So the charger has to be someplace in the projected width. There's exception 1 says if you have 2 charging stations right adjacent to each other, it can be within the projected width of both of them. The exception 2 talks about if you're doing an alteration, you can actually put the charger at the end, provided that that's not the accessible route. The accessible route would actually go across the drive aisle. And then if you're dealing with, you're coming in and doing like a parallel parking, and so you're putting the charger next to the long side of a parallel space, then the charger needs to be adjacent to that and no farther than 48 inches from the foot or the head. That's mainly so that you don't block the, if it was in the middle, it could block, somebody getting out of the door to be able to actually use the space itself. So those are the scoping requirements and the technical requirements that are in the CBC. So what I want to do is kind of, we had a code discussion group meeting for the CASI members not too long ago. And we talked about this, and we all get together and we kind of, there's lots of different interpretations about how this should work and where things should be. So I'm going to go through some things and talk about some design concepts and where my opinions as a CASP kind of disagree with other people's opinions as a CASP. As you can see here, I mean, we like to pull up examples sometimes that for non-compliant issues. So you can see here's the access aisle to come to this charging station, but that access aisle has no way to get to the accessible route because they're not allowed to actually go behind this vehicle to come in and go up that curb ramp. So this is an example of what not to do. Erica, is my menu bar showing on the screen, or can you see the full image? You're muted. We're good? Okay. So what I did is I kind of looked at, I designed some scenarios that are going to be parallel, parallel curb ramp situations, a perpendicular curb ramp situation, and where the accessible route is actually across the drive aisle. These are just to give you ideas of what can be done. They're not, tried and true, situations out there. So keep in mind, they're just design concepts and to use at your discretion. So like I said, here's a van space and a standard space, and they share an access aisle. So under the CBC, as soon as you come, if you have a parallel curb ramp situation, per 705.1.2.2.2.1, I think that's the right code section. It's kind of a one point of entry into the landing, and that curb ramp's landing situation requires you to have 36 inches of detectable warning, and then it actually requires 36 inches. You can see the dimension shows 38, and I'll explain that. But it's 36 inches of detectable warning and then 36 inches of walkway behind it. But if you lay out a charger, the charging unit can't obstruct the 48-inch walkway that's coming down that curb ramp. And so the maximum and the clear floor space for the charger can't be more than 10 inch, for reach ranges, 10 inches. And so the clear floor space can't interfere with the detectable warning. And so if the detectable warning is there and the unit set back 10 inches so as not to conflict with the curb ramp, then that's how I came up with that minimum 38 inches that you're going to need from the back of the detectable warning to the sidewalk, because as you place this curb ramp in there, when you place all the components in there, they start conflicting with each other as far as what the minimum dimensions that are required. So when you're placing that charger, keep all these other elements in mind that are dictated by the code. So what I did is I kind of placed it off to the side so that you could come across the detectable warning. You could turn and you could have a parallel approach. The reach range is within 10 inches. You can come back down and take the charger and plug in your car. So that was kind of the first parallel approach one that I kind of developed. The second one is, what if you take that charging unit and put it so that the path of the accessible route is totally independent of actually getting to the charger. So this one would allow you to, you'd have to come and turn on the detectable warning, which even a landing allows you to do that. This one kind of shows a forward approach, which is not a preferred approach according to the access board, but it is allowed. The other thing too is, all of that is all at the same level. So you could come in here, you could park your vehicle on this side, and you could actually come and access the unit here, and then you're right at your vehicle. So because you can place that vehicle in different spots, you can, because this isn't a marked clear floor space, it's just the area that's required to be there. Anyway, it makes it a little bit more usable to get to that. And keep in mind the clear floor space can't encroach into that detectable warning, which is why I didn't put the charger, closer to this location because of that detectable warning. So then I looked at, okay, so what if you have the path of travel, it's just kind of continuing in the same line as the accessible aisle. So you can see here the chargers are located in a position where you can have a clear floor space in front of them. What I looked at is pushing it far enough off the access aisle so that when somebody unplugs this and drags that cord across, it actually doesn't come across that access aisle. Because here again, if you take this charger and move it all the way up to the access aisle space, even though we could have one clear floor space that to access both of them, that charging cord is going to be coming and blocking that accessible route. So always keep thinking about where this cord is going to end up. So the next is I looked at if the accessible route now goes across the drive aisle, where can the chargers be? So I kind of have two locations. One is you could kind of put it perpendicular to the path. The other one's parallel. Both of them require a 34 by 48 inch clear floor space. The charger by code has to be within the projected width of the parking space of the station. It doesn't say the projected width of the access aisle, it's the projected width of the parking space itself. So those are kind of two locations where they could exist, where you have the clear floor space and all the cords can be out of the way. Now there is an exception to where the existing facilities are. You can actually place it at the head of the access aisle. Now, why this couldn't be used in new construction, I'm not sure. these bollards could be placed a little wider so that these cords don't actually block anything. Here you actually could have 5 feet in front of these bollards or even in between in order to access that. This can actually be pulled all the way to that line so that it's right there. I was trying to keep the cords out of that access aisle so that nobody could possibly complain about blocking it. Because if one vehicle's here and somebody else comes here and that cord is blocking the clear floor space to get to that, it could create some difficulties.
In the diagram to the right, that the charging station overlapped the drive aisle. Is that okay? I mean the access.
Yeah, I saw that when I was running through it the last minute. It's like, oh, I should have shifted it over just a tiny bit.
Okay, so you would want to shift it over.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem.
In order to meet the technical requirements of the code. So then I put this slide together. So this is kind of in our code discussion group that was kind of the recommended solution, I think, because it actually met all of the code requirements and kept everything at a minimum. So you could have your minimum 36 inches and your minimum 36-inch walkway to meet the parallel curb ramp requirements. The charger was actually sits up on a curb, but it's accessed from the walkway side. Has a clear floor space, that doesn't slope more than 2%. But in my opinion, it's horrible design if you're a user. And I say that because if you drive into this space and you're the driver of the vehicle and the charging port is on the rear passenger side, you'll probably drive into this forwards. You would get out of your car. When you leave your car, you have to go behind your vehicle. Now keep in mind that 2% slope requirements not required in the drive aisle. And, I've seen some built up drive aisles and, they build it right to the edge. And then this slopes some as much as 20 and 25%. Which creates some severe cross slope issues. So you have to come to the access aisle, and you come up the access aisle. You're on a landing that's per code, but you need to turn, you need to rotate around to turn 90 degrees, which a wheelchair user, now has to battle the detectable warning in order to make that turn. You come up the curb ramp, which, is built at less than 8.33%, and you get to the clear floor space at the charger, which can all slope at less than 2% in all directions. You get the cord. Now you've got to get back to it. So now there's no turnaround. It's only 48 inches minimum at the top. So there's really not a turnaround space. So now you're trying to turn around in a 48-inch space, or you can back down the curb ramp, I guess. Then you get to the landing again, and you have to negotiate another turn, and then take the cord all the way to your vehicle. And now the chargers move further away. So let's hope that the charging cord is long enough to reach the back of the vehicle. So even though this is 100% compliant to the code, I personally don't think it's a good design, because it does not take the user into account very much at all as far as having it a very usable situation.
So Louis, I've actually seen the Tesla, I think, has the charger in the back. Hi. And I've seen them back into stalls to charge.
Okay, so let's look at the same thing. Let's say that the charging unit is still on the passenger rear, and you back in. The vehicle's going to eat up this entire space. And so now you've got to take that cord and come all the way around your vehicle to get to the back.
No.
Or,
it's on this back right side.
The back.
Yeah, I saw one the other day. Or what is that? It was on the driver's side on the back.
Yeah.
So the guy had backed in, and he
Yeah.
was charging like right in that corner. So it actually would work.
If the port's on the same side as the driver,
Yeah,
if the port's on the opposite side of the driver and he backs in, then now the port's over here. And so you'd either have to drag the cord all the way around your car to park it, or
they have a
clear
pretty
floor
good
space.
pull. They have a pretty good pull. Like mine's on the front driver's side.
Yeah.
And so I pull in straight and I can pull the cord over.
Okay. Yeah, I have a slide here that the access board's put together, and I'm going to talk about some of these access things. So let's come back to that in just a minute.
So they don't have a national standard as to what side it's on. So it can be like a gas tank where they've got them on both sides of the car.
Yeah, it can be on both sides. It can be front and back. It can be in the total back in the center. There's no requirement of where that needs to be.
Well, if you're in a wheelchair, and let's say you're in one of those type of stalls that you talked about, and I've seen them where they basically make the stall 2% cross open, and then right on the edge, it drops off. I see this at Walmarts all the time.
All the time.
So now you're trying to get around to the other side, and you've got this massive cross slope. So how do you account?
Correct. The code does not account for that.
Well, that's all kinds of special. It's going to be a problem next code cycle then.
Yeah. Same's true with the parking space.
Huh.
So,
okay. Thanks.
yeah. So those are the CBC requirements. So DSA was developing their code requirements. I imagine at the same time the US Access Board was defining their requirements. Now, for the US Access Board, right now, they're just considered recommendations. They have not gone through the rulemaking process. So when the 2010 standards came out, there's nothing in the standards themselves to have requirements for EVCS. So since the 2010 standards to today, which has been 12 years now, they've developed some recommendations, but like I said, they haven't gone through the rulemaking process. So at this point, they're just recommendations. They're not required. But what they determined, they don't have, three different ones. They don't have a van one, a standard one, and an ambulatory one. They just have an accessible space, and that accessible space is 132 inches or 11 feet by 240 inches or 20 feet. So they actually made the space 2 feet longer, and it's narrower than a van space, but wider than a standard space for, if you're comparing it to the CBC. And the reason they did that is exactly what the conversation we were having. The access board started looking at, well, how's the driver come in and where's the port on his car? So as you can see in B1, if the driver and the port are on the same car, it's easy enough to back in, get out of your car, go to the charger and plug in your vehicle. Now keep in mind, under the ADA standards, there's no requirements for detectable warning. So some of their diagrams are going to be different than California because they don't have to be concerned about the detectable warning portion. As you can see here in B2, you could back in, and if you're a driver, you can get out of your car, you go to the charger, and you come back and go behind your vehicle to plug it in. So I looked up kind of the standard electric vehicle sizes. Until you get into trucks, there's only, I think, one that's longer than 17 feet, and none of them are wider than 8 feet. So if you think about it, if you have a space that's 11 feet wide and 20 feet long, almost any vehicle can pull into that space and have 3 feet of access aisle on the back or the side, which is why, the CBC actually has the 144 inches requirement and doesn't allow you to have that 8-foot access aisle, is for this very reason. So you can have that access space on the side. But once you go to 20 feet, then now you have the, an access space. It's not defined, but you have it in front or behind the vehicle. So you can see, if you look at F1, somebody pulled in all the way forward, they can get out of their car, they can go behind it, they can go to the charger and plug their charger in. Or you leave it a little bit short, you get out of your car, you come around, you go in front of your car, you get to the charging station, then you can come back and plug it in on the driver's side. So having a bigger space, that extra 2 feet allows a user to actually place his vehicle wherever they need to place it in order for them to be able to maneuver and get to wherever that charging point could be. So when you're designing these spaces, what I would recommend is to design it to 20 feet. One of these days, this standard will get adopted, and which means all of our 18-foot spaces will now become non-compliant. So there again, it's only a recommendation. I know every inch is tight on every site, but it would make it a lot more usable to have that extra 2 feet. So then I wanted to bring this slide up too, because there's a lot of difference of opinions amongst CASP as well, is where the clear floor space can be. Keep in mind that the image on the upper left, there again, they don't have the detectable warning requirements, so they placed it right at the end of the access aisle. So if you don't have to have detectable warning there, it can be right there. But what I noticed for the access board is they put their clear floor space into the electric vehicle space itself. Most of the CASP fund that we are talking to said, no, you can't do that. The space is for the space. And I'm like, well, why can't we do this? This is before I actually saw the diagrams from the access board. Because this actually makes it the most convenient for somebody who's in a wheelchair to be able to get out of their car. The charger is at the same level as the vehicle is, so it makes it a lot easier to get out of your vehicle, charge your car, and go on with life. So yeah, as you can see that, like in the lower left, the charger is placed on a walkway. Of course, that walkway is at the same level as the asphalt in the image, which in California, that would have to all be detectable warning. And then the clear floor space couldn't be at the charger right there because that would have to be detectable warning. But I like what they've done in the lower right too, where that charger's, here it actually would comply with the charger being in the projected width of the space. But this is showing that clear floor space in the space itself. And if you think about it in the CBC, if you only have an 18-foot space, if you have a 17-foot vehicle, you couldn't have the clear floor space there because your vehicle now is going to be 2 feet into the drive aisle, which you don't want to have either. So that's another thing to think about as far as actually designing it to be a 20-foot space to be as usable for everybody as possible. So those are kind of the design considerations for both the CBC and the ADA. And so once again, we like to plug our company. We're here to help with your accessibility needs. We do inspections and reports. We do plan reviews, consulting. We can help with work and drawings. I've been an architect for, I hate to say it, but almost 40 years now. It doesn't seem that long ago, but and then we send out the slideshow presentation to everybody who's on the call. So all the links to the different references are there. So the DSI advisory manual, if you don't have that, I highly recommend downloading it. That's become my Bible essentially. And this is true with not only EVCS, but anything accessible wise. Don't really go to the Access Board website because we are a lot more restrictive in California than the Access Board requirements. So I always use that as my reference manual. Another you know, if there's any civil engineers out there, I know that, you know, referring to some of the Caltrans standards is what civil engineers do more often. I've seen some of the Caltrans standards are actually, I don't go there very often, but some of the Caltrans standards actually are in conflict, in my opinion, with the CBC. And so really some of the Caltrans stuff is being built incorrectly. So always refer back to DSA's manual, because DSA actually has the authority to write the code. Caltrans does not. DSA also has a website that talks about electronic vehicle charging stations, and so that's the link to that. And then I only showed a few of the slides out of the access board. It's about a 40-page document that goes through and highlights a lot of other elements when it comes to EVC charging stations. So I highly recommend going and reviewing that. And like I said, just keep in mind, those are not standards. Those are just guidelines to help the designers do the right thing. And with that, we're open to questions.
Yes, I'm actually on the DSA website right now, and I see they only have the 2019 Access Compliance Advisory Manual. Do you know when or if publish one for the 2022 code?
Yeah, they won't publish that until the code comes out. But the one that's on there does have all the intervening code.
Oh, it does. Okay.
Yeah.
So if we were to download the current version, it should have all this stuff in it.
Yeah, it has the 2019 intervening codes.
Okay, great.
Okay, Erica,
We do not have any questions in the chat, so if anyone has questions, you are welcome to put them in the chat now, or just hop on and ask on video.
Hi, my name is Hyung-Gi Chun. I'm an architect at Watry Design. I have a quick question regarding each type of the EV chargers. So if you have level 1, level 2, and DC fast charger in your project, do you have to provide separate the EV ADA space for each type of EV chargers?
That's kind of how the code is written. I would think that, if you talk to, definitely verify it with the jurisdiction having authority, because they're the authority having jurisdiction. I always get that backwards. They're the ones who actually have ultimate say. I would think that if you provide each type of charging type at that accessible space, that it would be compliant, although that's not really how the code reads. So just present that and have them verify it specifically, that question. So that's the way I would handle it.
Okay, thank you.
No, you're welcome. Man, I must have done a great job at and being very clear, huh?
So there's one question in the chat that says, when do you anticipate that EV charging stalls will also be considered parking stalls, as EVs are going to be more prevalent as time goes on?
Oh boy, that's a good question. Yeah, if you look at the definitions in the current code, it specifically says that EVC charging stations are not parking spaces. And I've raised this question. It's like, well, what do you do with zoning? I mean, zoning requires a certain number of parking spaces, and you're not supposed to park in a charging station more than 2 or 3 hours to charge your car. So if you're providing all these electric vehicle charging stations and then you have to go and move your car to a parking space, how does that work? And the answer is, I have no idea. Currently, EVCS station is not a parking space. So I guess to answer the question is, you're going to have to go to the planning departments themselves to determine what's a parking space, do the EVC charging stations count as your parking space total? Are you supposed to provide additional EVCS stations in addition to the required number of parking? Those are all very good questions that have absolutely zero answers to that I know of.
So Karen did say that most cities have amended their zoning codes to allow EV spaces to be counted as parking spaces.
Yeah.
Right.
So-
I believe the 2022 Calgreen clarified that in chapter 4.
Okay.
It says, yeah, it can be counted toward required parking count in required by local jurisdiction.
Oh, perfect. Thanks for clarifying that. Yeah, that's not a code I go and read very often. So that's coming out of the new code then.
Yes, 22 code.
Perfect. Thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, the table that you showed, that actually shows just the EV stalls. Is that based upon the number of parking stalls that are in the lot, or how does that ratio work?
No, it's based on the number of EV charging. So
So is that a voluntary number? That there's no minimum?
the minimum number of EV charging on a site?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually dictated more by cities and counties in their planning department, as opposed to there's nothing specific in the CBC that requires the minimum number of parking spaces now. And currently in the green code, I know that they don't have a minimum number. I don't know what the 2022 green code says, so I don't know if they actually change that.
So that's only if you provide that number that you have to meet the standards?
As soon as you start providing EVC charging, that's when the accessible standards kick in.
And there's an adaptable unit that's not in the normal accessibilities in 11B chapter 5. So what is that? Adaptable versus standard versus van accessible?
Adaptable?
What's the difference? Yeah.
There's
no
not an
adaptable unit in the standards for accessibility, as far as I know. You said there were 3 of them.
What's that?
You said there was 3 types. There was van accessible, standard accessible, and adaptable.
No, there's van, there's standard, and there's ambulatory.
Yeah, I'm sorry, ambulatory. My apology. I got the term wrong.
Yeah.
But there is no ambulatory stall in the regular accessibility standards. So where is that defined?
It's in the scoping requirements
Of the EV stalls?
Yeah. So once you exceed, I think 26.
So it does describe what it looks like and all that.
Yeah. So basically it's 10 feet wide.
Okay.
Yeah. So once you get to 26, so 26 to 50, you have to have 1 ambulatory stall.
Okay.
So ambulatory means you can walk, but I'm not quite sure why they have an ambulatory stall, but they do.
Okay. All right.
And then in the chat, Karen let us know that there is 10% requirement in Cal Green for new construction. And then you're going to want to check with your city if they require EV for. Yep.
So is that in current code or is that 2022, Karen?
That's the current code. It might go up because it's already gone from 8 to 10 in the last couple of years.
Okay.
I happen to know this because Caroline and I are knee deep in EV stalls right now. So,
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I only get involved in the accessible side, so I never try and
Yeah.
figure out how many are required.
well, and like if you're working on a big site, just when you start to like distribute EV stalls, because fire marshals don't like to see them all in garages, then you have to distribute those accessible stalls, and it becomes kind of a nightmare.
Yeah, and yeah, I have a difference of opinion about that too. So, see, I think that kind of like the parking, that, why would you want to put an accessible stall farther away from an entry just so it's near where your EV charging stations are? But I'm actually in discussions with the city right now about moving all of those to being more convenient rather than being as far away as possible.
Karen, your comment about parking garages, is that because these lithium batteries tend to go up occasionally?
Yeah, in particular, it seems to be the Tesla battery.
Yeah, so you're talking about potential fire danger. Are they prohibiting them under?
No, because so I'll just give you an example. In the city of Belmont, what the fire marshal said was there could be any number of electric or hybrid vehicles stored in the garage at any given time, and any one of them could combust.
Right.
He told me that if I could invent a tow truck that could get a burned up vehicle out of a garage, I would be wealthy. So that's not really my skill set. So
well, lithium fires really burn hot. That actually is a very valid
The
concern.
problem is they burn for a long time.
Yes.
And so, and they take massive quantities of water. In fact, that was just on the news yesterday for the cars in Florida that are just like spontaneously catching fire.
Yeah.
But it seems to be that Teslas are more problematic than other electric vehicles. So it's just something to keep in mind. He had us up the requirements for our garage. Watry's actually doing our garage. And he had us up the fire protection requirements and create a safe place for the firemen to be, so they could, kind of watch the car burn out. So
yeah, and that's not actually in the code. That's something that's almost a personal preference thing.
yeah, but that's the difference between the fire marshal and the building official, right? The fire marshal can say whatever he wants and demand that.
Actually, they can't. It's got to be approved through the CSPC.
Fire marshal wears a badge. He's like,
yeah, but they have to have it approved through local ordinance. You can't mandate anything just on personal preference. It's just part of the building code.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I've dealt with fire marshals who have said this is the code according to me.
Yeah, I know, and they're breaking the law. That honestly, if you look at building standard law, but yeah, I don't doubt that there are some that do overstep, and they're probably for reasons that are valid, actually. So,
sometimes.
Yeah.
I didn't think he was asking for so much, and I think the cost of what he was asking for will just be buried in the bids.
Yeah. Well, it's actually a valid concern in this case.
Yeah.
Sorry, we sort of drifted away from the accessibility issue.
Yeah, but it's very, very valid. I was wondering if there are standards coming out. That's kind of why I was probing here a little bit.
Well, I would expect to see potentially something there and something around car stackers, because that's another place where fire marshals are requiring fire protection.
Car stackers?
Mm-hmm. So in order to get more cars into a garage or onto a site, people are reverting to these car stackers. And
you're talking about the kind. Okay, so you're talking about the actual, the actual lifts that lift one up over the other.
Right.
Yeah.
And so they, fire marshals I've been dealing with right now, as long as they're outside, they're like, well, we can deal with a fire outside. But if they're inside of a building, like in San Francisco, they require fire protection.
Okay. Yeah, and
Sorry,
as long as
that
it's
really drifted off of the topic there. So
Yeah,
I would
Well,
expect to see something in the new code about that too.
yeah, you'll find that stuff sometimes in the local ordinances, and if it's approved in the local ordinance, they can enforce it, but it's just, it has to be gone through public process. So, all right.
yeah. And the accessibility portion of those car stackers too, that's a big topic of conversation too, because especially somebody who's driving a vehicle that, you know, it's designed for them to drive. You know, you can't just get out of it and have somebody else step in. And so, you know, designing
Well,
places that have car stackers, you actually have to have accessible spaces to park so that
yes.
you have to have accessible loading and unloading so somebody can take your vehicle. You also have to have accessible parking spaces if somebody can't take your vehicle. So,
But wouldn't you park people that had vehicles like that in the accessible spaces? And the stackers would be for people who
Right.
got to work late and have to park in the back of the lot and
yeah, I think that there are some
hand
designs
their
coming
car
through.
over to someone.
This is over in San Francisco, you know, designing a stacker unit and they had no parking whatsoever. It's everything was stacked. And it's like, no, you can't do that.
I don't think you can do that.
You
Yeah.
cannot do that. You have to have accessible spaces.
Yeah.
So,
I think a lot of people don't like them because there's a lot of, let's just say that maybe the people driving onto those stackers aren't the best drivers. You know, you're damaging cars and it's,
right.
so people don't like to use them. They're generally operated by valets, but not always. So I think most people try and avoid them. They're kind of a last resort right now.
Okay. Erica, were there any other questions that came in actually regarding EVCS?
There were no other questions.
Okay, so we
Oh,
can
wait,
just
no,
chat
I'm
as-
sorry, there was.
Oh.
This
There's one
one,
about-
says, yeah, I realize this is an AHJ question and not CBC, but have any planning departments that you have worked with allowed EV charging units to be located within the required landscaping areas? I'm guessing it's the charger itself.
the charger itself? Yeah, I don't know. That's my answer.
You'd have the clearance requirements anyway, so I'm not sure how much room you'd have left in a planner normally.
And I
Yeah,
think you need the pathway anyways.
and yeah, you'd have to, I mean, because you'd have to have the clear floor space.
Right.
as- And the unit itself has to sit at the same level. Oh, you know, one of the things I didn't mention is, you know, the chargers, there's an exception for fuel dispensing units where, you know, you can go to 54 inches. According to the access board, this is not a fuel dispensing unit. And so it's that 48-inch maximum height. The exception for fuel dispensing does not apply.
Actually, the other thing is the chargers serve 2 cars. So that's why
Some
you generally,
chargers, not all.
most of them. I
Most,
think.
I would say most.
Yeah.
You can have single port ones though. So, yeah, I've seen it where they put one charger in and there again, you know, where do you put it so that you can do 2 accessible vehicles? It makes it really difficult because you can't drag it across the access aisle. And if you put it in between, you know,
It does, you don't make the distances, I don't think.
exactly. So,
Yeah. I think we ended up having to separate them on another project.
yeah, it makes, so that's one of, you know, when you're trying to put all these elements together to make all the code issues work, it does make it difficult. I think that's why people wanted to put it up on top of the sidewalk, is so that you could have a dual charging port and you could have a charging station, you know, adjacent to the accessible one that's not accessible and only have one charger. But it doesn't make it, like I said, very user friendly. Okay,
Thank you.
any,
Right, that-
Any
there's no
others?
questions from the chat.
no more in the chat? Okay. Anybody have any accessible questions that they want to throw at me? Good to see you, Karen. How's Steve doing?
He's doing okay. He had his first infusion yesterday. So
Oh, good.
yeah. So fingers
Okay.
crossed. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Hope everything goes well.
Yeah, me too. Thank you. It's good to see you. It's good to see
Good to see
Erica
you.
too.
Yeah, she's in
Erica-
Tennessee these days.
I know. I was gonna say, are you in Tennessee?
I am.
So it's hot.
It's so cold here right now.
Oh, really?
So cold. Yeah,
Oh.
it's great. I love it.
So, yeah, so thanks everyone for coming in. You're welcome to drop off or sit around and chat, whatever you'd like to do.
Thanks.
But
It's
thank
good
you.
to see you guys. Take care.
Yeah.
You too, Karen. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Oh,
you,
you're
everyone.
welcome.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and hit end.